Having a discourse where we only say bad things about one group and only good things about the other does not serve any positive function. And it really is hurtful, I think, to everyone in society. The problem is, if I say something that's positive about white people, large sections of the culture, maybe the large majority, are going to actually literally perceive that statement, no matter what it is, to be false, racist, and immoral. So people have really internalized splitting at a deep level. It shapes their reasoning, it shapes their morality, their identities, what they can feel and not feel, and everything about their worldview, how they perceive events.
You must be some kind of therapist?
I am some kind of therapist, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the inner wilderness. I've invited brilliant guests from all walks of life to join me as we investigate, illuminate, and inspire transformation in ourselves, intimate relationships, and the social ecosystems we are constellated in. What you are about to hear may surprise you, so hang on to your earbuds for a hefty dose of sanity in a chaotic world. I am Stephanie Wynn, a licensed marriage and family therapist, branching out and building bridges between psychology and everything else under the sun. It's my honor to have you along for the ride. Let's get started. Today, my guest is Andrew Hartz, PhD. He's a clinical psychologist in New York City, as well as a supervisor and a professor of clinical psychology at Long Island University in Brooklyn. He operates a private practice and has written for The Federalist, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Real Clear Education, and Heterodox Academy, as well as recently appearing on the podcast You Can't Have It Both Ways. So excited to dive in to psychology with Andrew today. We've had a couple of private chats with lots of interesting stuff to talk about, and we have some shared observations and concerns about some things related to the field of psychology as they pertain to the broader culture. So I'm excited to see where our conversation today goes. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I gave a brief introduction, but can you tell our audience a little bit more about you, your background, and what it is that you do?
So I'm a psychologist in private practice in New York City, and I'm also a professor in my old PhD program in Brooklyn. And I work with adults and children. I have an integrative approach. I use lots of different CBT, DBT, ACT therapy approaches, but most of my training is psychodynamic. I did training. I'll say this. I did some training at the White Institute in New York, which was Eric Fromm and Harry Stack Sullivan's old institute, and at Columbia Medical Center. And so mostly psychoanalytic.
So I know we've discussed some shared concerns about where the field of psychology is going, where counseling is going, and how our culture at large is relating to concepts from psychology. Let's just start there. What are some of the things that you've been wanting to speak out about lately?
Well, the most recent thing that I wrote about was an issue for the need for non-woke therapy options for people that, on the one hand, you have a lot of people who are increasingly self-censoring, isolated, ostracized, maybe even antagonized for their political beliefs. And at the other hand, you have a mental health profession that's increasingly ideological itself. So at the exact time when you have this growing population of people who've been antagonized for their political beliefs, they can't assume that their therapist is going to be able to get it and help them. And in fact, the therapist might even reject them for the same way they were rejected at their job or in school. I gave some examples in the article. I'll say one was that I was at a clinic and the patient had a female, woman of color therapist, and the patient said that he thought he didn't get a fellowship because of affirmative action, and that was upsetting to him. And this was discussed in the clinic, and the clinic-wide consensus was that the patient had to be told that they were racist, and that if they didn't agree to change, he'd be asked to leave therapy. But I've seen more and more of that. I'll give one example that wasn't in the article real quick. When I was at one place where I did my training, there was a meeting with all the psychologists, maybe about a dozen or two, and the issue of race came up. An immigrant woman of color shared that she had a white male patient that she saw who she hated, not because of anything he did, but simply because of his race and his gender. And the response of the room was, "We totally understand why you would feel that way. That makes total sense. And you're so heroic and brave for sharing that." And I was the only white male in the room. I didn't say anything. And then, the next week, the same thing came up, and people were praising this person for expressing her hatred of her white male patient, who she continued to see. And I said, what about me? I'm the only white male in the room. Do people hate me? Do they think I deserve to be hated? I spoke up, and as soon as I spoke up, I started getting problems. And, booking a room suddenly became harder. There were new paperwork issues. People that wanted to hang out with me before didn't anymore. And most of it was indirect, but it just made everything harder. I don't regret saying what I said, but there was a lot of costs to it. And I realized, I felt bad for this patient whose therapist hated him for his race, and that he wasn't even told or allowed to switch. And I was thinking about all the people in the country who've had experiences like mine, who are antagonized at work, lose friends, and thinking, where do they go for help? The mental health field is not necessarily the place they can go. They need help, they need support. When I was going through that, it would have been really wonderful to have somebody that I could call, get advice about, get support, and there's no one to call, And so I think putting it all together, there's this enormous gap in our field. Lots of patients really need help around these issues, and no one's providing it. And we need to create it.
I've seen what you're talking about, and I had a number of incidents similar to those leading up to the time that around the same period of time, joined Twitter, started a blog, decided to start a podcast, all of that kind of stuff. And I was seeing this before I joined Twitter. I was in a couple of Facebook groups for therapists, and one of these was a very well-known, very large Facebook group. And I witnessed this takeover of the group by a handful of activists who seemed to feel that it was their job to police anything and everything that took place in that group for anything that could be construed as racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, or any form of bigotry, and to school and educate people. And things just became increasingly radicalized with no insight that I would think we would bring about, nuance, complexity, splitting, which you've talked about, the drama triangle, groupthink, all of these things that you would think as mental health professionals trained in psychology that would be able to bring some degree of insight into our own behavior and the group dynamics that were taking place there. But it was very disconcerting to see this. And I wrote a tweet thread that went kind of viral about one of the more extreme examples I saw of this. I had posted an innocent question asking what people thought of just how unprofessional was it to arrive to a session with wet hair. Because I am a female with long straight hair, in case you haven't noticed, and sometimes I'm not all that great at time management, and sometimes I'm rushing, I'm running late. I have to think about, like, do I let my hair be too greasy and not wash it today, or do I wash it and not have time to dry it? Um, and my question about, is it unprofessional to have wet hair, led to of course, the conclusion that the question was a white supremacist question, because because it lacked sensitivity to the unique hairstyling needs of people with different types of hair than mine, and I got schooled on this to no end.
Mhm.
That's kind of an extreme example. And you and I have talked a little bit privately about the types of behaviors that are characteristic of personality disorders and how those behaviors are flourishing in our culture. And this reminds me of what narcissistic emotional abuse looks like, right? You do something
Mhm.
completely innocent, and then there's this outrage, this how dare you, don't you know how evil you are for asking an
Mhm.
innocent question. So I've seen that in the field. Um, and another thing I saw shortly before kind of entering this chapter of my life where I decided to enter the public sphere was I had actually sought counseling from someone who seemed quite qualified. Um, Actually, I wanted to meet with her to find out whether she might be a fit for counseling or whether I might decide to consult with her as a supervisor. This is after getting my license, but I figured, it's nice to have someone to consult with on occasion. Um, and I specifically sought this person out. One of the reasons I sought her out was because she was bicultural, and I actually related to that because I was working through some issues of my own identity that I was starting to think of as bicultural in nature. And there were a lot of other things on her website that made her seem, quite qualified. She was PhD level or PsyD. She was a teacher and supervisor, and she seemed quite competent. I'd reached out to her, saying, "Hey, could we have a brief consultation? I want to see if you might be an appropriate fit for either a supervisor or a therapist for me." And I guess somehow she had registered that in her mind only as that I was considering supervision and not therapy. Um, and she, which she would have been free, of course, to set the boundaries of, no, I will only consider you for one or the other. Let's talk with that in mind. I would have respected that. But she registered it that way. And then in our meeting, um, she jumped to a conclusion about why I would seek out a bicultural therapist. The conclusion she jumped to, or a bicultural supervisor, the conclusion she jumped to was that I was carrying some kind of white guilt and white fragility, and that I was seeking to be educated by a bicultural person who had put on a pedestal, and that her first order of business was to correct my white fragility in my way of thinking about her. All of this she jumped to
Right.
without asking me, what is it about having a bicultural person in your counseling sphere that you think you would benefit from? Right. And the truth of that being, I'm struggling to integrate my own cultural identity because I walk in many worlds. Right. And uh, my background
Right.
actually involves uh, racially motivated abuse. I have been a victim of racially motivated abuse. And of course, that doesn't fit the narrative, right? According to these narratives, if you're white, it's impossible for you to have been a victim of race-based abuse. So I had actually wanted help kind of healing from that and integrating my different cultural influences that have made up who I am. So that was one of those alarming experiences, and then I've seen that in my own patients. Some of the things they've shared, and I've seen it by branching outside of my clinical work to join the broader community of people dialoguing online. And my eyes have really been opened to how many people there are who have a negative, distrustful view of us as therapists, and who therefore don't feel like they can seek the kind of help that we're ideally qualified to provide. One of my, some of the populations I'm most passionate about extending an olive branch to are people who have been harmed by gender medicine. I call them victims of gender medicine. So that includes parents of youth with rapid onset gender dysphoria, detransitioners and desisters, all of whom have either had directly negative and scarring experiences of trying to seek counseling, or who've heard enough stories of other people's experiences that they're afraid to try it out. Here in Oregon, we have more of a need for therapy than we can supply. And so I'm imagining that many of my colleagues here, their practices are full with people for whom their virtue signaling is a good marketing strategy. And so if they're not explicitly, deliberately looking outside of the people who are coming to them, who do have a positive view of what therapy is, then they're not seeing this perspective. So I hope that our conversation will reach some of those therapists who maybe haven't thought about this before, haven't thought about how signaling what they call quote unquote inclusivity doesn't always have the effect of making everybody feel like this is truly an inclusive place for them.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think all your examples, I mean, they highlight that there are, non-PC issues that a lot of people are struggling with, and would like, I think, could benefit from a place where they're able to talk freely and openly about. At the same time that the mental health field is so increasingly narrow, um, and I think more dogmatic about how they think all these should play out. Yeah, if you say that you're LGBT friendly as a therapist, that could, I think this is kind of what you're saying, right? That could signal to people that if they're concerned about the detransitioning experience, this is a therapist who won't get it. If they say that they're like inclusive of racial minorities or in favor of diversity or something like that, that may signal to some people, depending on how it's done, perhaps, that this is not somebody who I could talk about my experience of anti-white aggression that I've been through with, because they're going to come with it from a different perspective. So I think even just saying that you're strongly against racism, which, it's factually a good thing to be, but it codes now as as a signifier of a particular ideology, and people who don't share that might feel like, okay, now I can't talk about some of my concerns with what's dubbed anti-racism today. Um, so I think that there need to be ways that people, I do think that there's a fairly large population of people who are concerned about this and would like to get help. And maybe they've given up. Maybe they can't imagine that resources like this would exist. Maybe they don't realize that they could get help around these things. But they don't know where to go, or they try to just, they go into regular therapy or therapy with just a regular somebody they find online, and they decided, well, I'm just going to not talk about these really important issues in my life. I'll just avoid them or lie about them or something like that. And I think plenty of people do that too. That's really going to affect your treatment to have things that you feel really strongly about that you assume your therapist won't be able to get, so you're going to self-censor about them. I mean, that's going to shape, I think that is a real impediment to good treatment. Yeah, but I think there's a, I mean, I don't know how people do it. They're at work or they're at school and they don't agree with an ideology that's put aggressively down their throat every day, and they have nowhere to go and no supports. And I don't know how they do it. And people aren't going to be able to speak up or get organized or develop alternatives or improve things if they can't connect and get support. so they can process maybe some of the frustration, some of the stresses related to it, the anxieties related to it, and figure out ways to constructively um, take steps that they feel are right for them around these issues.
I feel like there used to be an ethos in our field where it was understood that we have a professional responsibility to put some boundaries around our own worldview, our own religion, culture, political beliefs, that we have a responsibility to be able to serve a diverse community and to be aware of how our own biases can affect how we perceive and are able to treat our patients in the context of their lives, their values, and their worldviews. And I feel like this concept has been lost, and it's also been distorted and twisted to mean its opposite. So, I use the term bias in its classic sense. Um,
Right.
and yet, what I see a lot of in the field is kind of this progressive interpretation of the word bias, right? Where there's one direction in which a person can have bias. A person can have bias that is white against non-white racism, straight against gay discrimination, cis against trans discrimination. Uh, you know, there's one direction in which discrimination goes, and it fits with the intersectional model of who is deemed privileged and who is deemed oppressed. And so then clinicians have kind of distorted their responsibility into this endless self-scrutiny of I have to cleanse my mind obsessively of my so-called bias. But it's always in one direction, which itself is a bias. If you're looking through a filter that sees the world in those terms, then what are you not seeing? What are you missing out on? And so now people are openly biased and refusing to
Right.
question those biases and how they affect ethical treatment. And it's just shocking to me to know that any therapist would be rewarded for saying that she hates a patient. Now, it's one thing to say it's really insightful of you and brave of you to say something uncomfortable that you could be judged for. But then you don't proceed to say that that's an okay way to be, right? You say this is
Right.
one of those issues that we stop and deal with in supervision, and we have to evaluate. First of all, are you fit to continue treating this patient? Because the
Right.
only way you're going to be fit to continue treating this patient is if you can address your countertransference through supervision, through whatever you need to do, to the point where you do not harbor hatred towards your patient. That's an obstacle. So the fact that it just
Right.
stops there of how brave of you to say this and now there's no problem here,
Yes.
it's horrifying.
Well, and there's, I think, and I do think that the issue of maybe in particular anti-white hate or anti-male hatred, maybe, but especially anti-white hatred, is something that it's not that rare of an experience. I mean, and bullying and antagonism and the full spectrum of things, even outright violence, it's not that rare that there can't be services around it. I think there's part of it is there are cultural norms among white people not to talk about it, and not to deal with it. If you're at a school where minority kids are bullying a white kid with racially charged bullying, the adults are often unsure or hesitant to address it. They don't know what they're worried about how to, so they don't, or, and parents of those kids often don't understand the experience, don't know how to support them. Um, and then if they tell their friends or they tell other people, maybe later in life, if this happened to them, you know, are they going to say, well, but you're privileged and they're victims? It's like, and so the experience of invalidation is just so common, and it's something that's considered unacceptable to talk about, which I think makes the trauma potentially around it all that much worse. Um, And then you go into therapy and your therapist says, well, but you're privileged. Or they're thinking you can tell or something that that's what's going on, is like they don't actually recognize what it's like to have chronic or systematic race hatred directed at you that's invalidated and not addressed, and that you're almost seen as deserving it or it not being a big deal by everyone in your life. And then you hear that from your therapist. And it's like, I think that's in particular a big one. And think about it. I mean, you have that history, and then you go to work and you have to go to white fragility training. And the trainings that you're going to for your job or at college mirror the types of insults that you endured from the bullies. It's that you're white fragile, or like white stupid, whatever it is. It's like, stupid white boy, or whatever it is that you got insulted with. But those are the types of things that people deal with. And obviously I don't agree with that language, but but then you're getting it again in a required social justice class in college, where you have to write a paper about how you're fragile to pass the class, and basically indicate that you agree to an extent with the things that your bullies insulted you for. And very hard to find supports around this for this population. Where do they go? I mean, I don't have a list of providers that I could find with people who I feel like I could trust to treat these issues, individual or group or anything. There's no specializations. I think there's not a lot of research. It's insane. But I mean, just as one example of the type of thing, these huge, totally unserved populations.
There are many layers of harm and ripple effects to reinforcing these narratives about racism and other problems. You talk about a child being bullied. So that was my experience. So I was that kid, right? I was that white kid who grew up in a predominantly Black community, with a little bit of Hispanic community nearby. And in my little world, Black was the majority. Black was cool. Black was popular. I wanted to be Black because you want to fit in as a kid, right? And I was 7 when the LA riots happened in 92 following the Rodney King situation. And that was my neighborhood that went down in. And
Wow.
following those riots, I mean, I witnessed the riots. There were ashes falling into my patio from all the fires. I witnessed things exploding. I witnessed the looting. My school was shut down for 3 days. And after that, the few remaining other white families in the neighborhood left. And the racial tension in the neighborhood was higher. And I was a kid. I was 7, and then I was 8, and then I was 9. And think about what the other kids at that age are being told by their parents about race relations, and how a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old brain processes that information, right? It's literally black and white thinking is all they're capable of, right? So it's like, oh, these riots
Right.
are happening because racism, because white people are bad, white people are out to get us, white people were slave owners, now they're killing us in the streets. That's the narrative. So then how does
Right.
that narrative get interpreted and manifested by a child? There's a white girl, we got to get her, right?
Yeah.
So then at 7, I'm being blamed for the entire history of race relations in America, right? Like
Right.
I'm scapegoated when I'm at an age when I'm so naive that I just want the life I'm seeing on Family Matters. And I have a crush on Will Smith because he's the Fresh Prince. Like, and I
Right. Right.
am
Right.
like singing TLC songs, right? Like that was my life as a kid. I just wanted to play with all the other kids. And I'm the scapegoat for all of this history.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons I'm so concerned with the narratives that we see now. What to speak of what happens when someone with an experience like that goes to therapy, right? But But when we're teaching children these particular narratives, how do their brains make sense of that? How does that get acted out? Because there's not a child in this world that deserves to be threatened, harassed, taunted, name-called, and assaulted, as I was for 9 years,
Right.
because of the color of their skin. There's not a child in this world that is responsible either for the history of slavery or for any of these problems. And so you just see the pendulum swing. You just see the black and white rigid mind carrying out these problems over and over, right? But according to woke therapists, my experience did not exist.
Right.
That wasn't racism, or
Right.
or I deserved it. Yikes. I think there are
It's
probably many people having those experiences.
I'm positive. I mean, yeah, and I'll be talking to somebody who I think of as like a liberal person, nothing at all, and I'll mention, and they'll tell a story, and there really is a culture of silence around this stuff, and I think a lot of people, they bury it, or they have a little online community, or or they're totally isolated, or they just feel hopeless, they don't have any support. I mean, I think that is very common, and that's why it's so important to provide help and support for this population. So I think a lot of people have experiences like yours, a lot more people than we know about, and they run the gamut from chronic, quite aggressive bullying. It can involve, physical attacks, other really shaming, humiliating, ostracizing types of things that can be incredibly painful. And some of it comes as a kid, some of it can be in the community, in your neighborhood, or or it can happen at work. It can happen anywhere. And I think a lot more people have these experiences, but they seem to not speak out about it. There aren't supports for them. There aren't ways to network. And so I think a lot of people bury it, repress it, ignore it, or they have a little online community or something like that. But it's really stunning to me how often people describe really horrific experiences that then they don't speak about, don't organize about, don't address.
How are you sleeping? Sleep is a foundation of mental and physical health, equally important to nutrition and exercise, yet it's often the first thing to go during times of stress. Good sleep can help alleviate depression and anxiety symptoms, maintain a healthy weight and metabolism, protect your heart, and even reduce the risk of Alzheimer's. Yet still, 1/3 of Americans struggle with sleep, and temperature is one of the main reasons. Before I got an 8 sleep, I was already an expert in sleep hygiene and practiced what I preached to my clients. But I would still wake up overheated in the middle of the night and unable to fall back asleep for 1 or 2 hours. Adjusting the air temperature and blankets was not enough. The mattress itself was keeping me hot. But now, I'm sleeping soundly through the night and waking up refreshed thanks to my 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover. The Pod Pro cover by 8 Sleep is the most advanced solution on the market for thermoregulation. It pairs dynamic cooling and heating with biometric tracking. The cover can adjust the temperature on each side of the bed individually for you and your partner based on your sleep stages, biometrics, and bedroom temperature, reacting intelligently to create the optimal sleeping environment. If you'd like to be more patient with your children, more emotionally stable with your partner, a fitter athlete, or more efficient at work, take it from me, a mental health professional. Improving your sleep is one of the best investments you can possibly make in your overall well-being and the lives of everyone you touch. Go to 8sleep.com to check out the pod and use the code SOMETHERAPIST at checkout to start sleeping cool this summer with up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. And yes, to my listeners around the world, 8 Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. All right, now back to the show. You and I both have a foundation in relational psychodynamic therapy, which places emphasis on understanding what's happening in the room between the client and therapist through the transference and countertransference, and how a patient might be unconsciously reenacting familiar relational patterns. And we're trained in methods of being able to explore that and utilize what's coming up in the here and now in therapy to address some of those kind of deep relational patterns that have been established for the person. And I was saying before we recorded that I was trying to be welcoming and encouraging when one of my patients finds the insight and the courage to say something to me like, I was worried that you were going to be disappointed in me, because that's
Mm.
relational psychodynamic therapy. That's the rupture
Uh-huh.
and repair, right? Um, and I think a lot of more modern therapists don't necessarily go that route with their education, or they don't have that relational foundation. And that doesn't mean that they can't be a perfectly good therapist or can't be aware of what's happening in real time in the room. But do you think that some of these patients who are afraid or hesitant to say something about their own personal traumas or anxieties or struggles that don't fit the woke narratives, do you think that they ever leave breadcrumbs or test the therapist, or,
Yeah.
what are some ways that that shows up where they're trying to figure out, is this a place where I'm going to be judged or where I'm going to be accepted and understood?
Yeah. Well, let me say, I think there's two things. The first is, I think a lot of times, a lot of people who have these experiences, it almost like doesn't seem to even occur to them that it would be possible that there would be places where they could get support and process what they're feeling so that it's not so painful to them, and find ways to speak out about it assertively, build social connections where they're not alone with it, and can do things constructively about these issues. I think a lot of people, it hasn't even occurred to them that such resources could potentially exist. There is a little bit of a feedback loop where patients aren't looking for these services, therapists aren't advertising that they offer these services, so patients don't look, so therapists don't offer. And I think we should try to get out of that loop. And I think that probably is going to come from the therapist end of, I know there are people out there. We're here to talk. We need to build networks where we can offer these services and encourage patients who've had these experiences, anybody who's had these experiences, like, to come, that you don't have to be alone with it, and you can find your voice to address this in a way that feels right to you. So I think that's a central issue. My guess is, yeah, I think people test the waters, and there are little signs and that people do, and it's like, uh, you know, I mean, somebody has an American flag or something like that. It's an indication of something sometimes that means something to them. Um, maybe, or maybe they push here or there. But it's if you've had a chronic experience of being invalidated for your experience, it's going to be hard to speak up about it. And their therapists are hesitant to make the leap. Is this what you're talking about? Because there's an answer that it's no. And so I think there's hesitancy on both sides to address it, which is all the more reason just to build it into the services. That if you feel frustrated at your school or at your college or at your job around these issues, or in your community, you're trying to figure out how to build social network or meet partners or speak up around this, just to have, it'd be great if there was a website they could go to, a number they can call where they could find somebody who could do some sort of consultation or longer term therapy around this.
And that would be a good resource for people who know that their views are unorthodox. Um, and,
Right.
here in Portland, Oregon, with the kind of clientele that I'm accustomed to working with, many of them are very loyal to progressive viewpoints and narratives. And I have what I think are, my best approximation at appropriate professional boundaries with remembering what my job is, which is to work with a client in the context of their worldview, not mine. So I'm not using therapy to, push my anti-woke views onto people, but I do see how their views play out for them and how they're interrelated with their mental health. An example that comes to mind is someone who was a victim of a crime, but did not engage the police because of narratives about police and Black people, right? There's this, I'm going to be doing harm to Black people if I call the police when I'm a victim of a crime. There are also times I see people who are, putting up with a lot of mistreatment in a relationship, or they're dealing with a very emotionally immature person, but they feel afraid to say anything unsavory about that person because that person is trans, or because they're a person of color, or, there's something about this person where they belong to this protected category. And so I'm obligated to put up with this behavior and try to interpret it in the best way possible, even though it's hurting me. So I see those kinds of things come up. I also see how self-hatred consumes a lot of people's time and energy, or, guilt and feeling the need to endlessly self-examine for all the forms of bias they've decided they're guilty of. And I see how that takes away valuable life force from other things that could be more meaningful to them. And I don't see relationships getting closer. That's the sad and ironic thing. I actually feel like we've gotten further apart because we're all walking on eggshells. And I wonder if you see that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think maybe in particular, I mean, I think there is a paradigm of young white women who have an enormous amount of racial guilt that they've extremely internalized, and it can lead them to, as you say, have relationships, romantic relationships that are even abusive and really unhealthy, that they feel that they have to endure, and it can be totally traumatizing for them, and they're not thinking about, what do I want in a partner? What do I find fulfilling? And I mean, so I think there's so many iterations of it. It's hard. It's harder to think about somebody who really feels strongly attached to these ideologies, and you're concerned that they might be contributing to symptoms. That's trickier. That's very tricky to address in therapy, and maybe those need to be addressed more just outside of therapy, honestly. I think if we talk about them outside of the context, maybe people can become more aware that these things do happen. I mean, I think there are men who have intense self-hatred for their gender, and maybe that leads to, again, not speaking about their needs in relationships, maybe sexual dysfunctions, things like that. But a lot of them have fully internalized it. And I mean, you can even imagine a couple where both people in the couple are unsatisfied with the dynamic that they feel ideologically committed to, and they can't speak up. And what do you do as the couple's therapist? Do you raise this as an issue? I think those are just incredibly difficult clinical decisions to make.
Yeah, and when you think about the implications of, or all the ways it could manifest, a male who has self-hatred because of his beliefs about, let's say, toxic masculinity, right? What's going to play out in the relationship with the therapist if the therapist is female, which many of us are? Is there going to be some transference there of idealization of, looking up to the woman as the authority figure who's there to correct or purify him, or whose approval he needs. And I think if we lack a relational foundation, or if we just go with that narrative and we agree with his narratives about all masculinity being toxic, for instance, then we miss some valuable opportunities there. And then I think as well about what you said with couples. I've seen in couples where, let's say there's an interracial couple where during times of stress, the person of the racial minority uses the white person's whiteness as a fighting point. You're doing that white person thing again, right? And it's like, if the therapist is ideologically captured, or if we're not allowed to explore that for fear of disrupting someone's worldview, then we're missing an enactment of something that I think we're meant to treat at such a deeper level, right? Because just because it's about race on the surface, I mean, I would prefer to be able to treat that the same way I'd treat any other step in a dance of a couple, right? Which is like, I'm feeling threatened or dissatisfied or resentful about fill in the blank. And my reaction to that is I'm looking for a way to get my power back. And so here's the nearest rock I can throw at you, which is that you're white and you're doing that white person thing again, right? But there's this kind of sacredness around race where you can't touch it. You can't explore how that could be an enactment of something else, or an attempt to get a need met, but not a successful attempt, not a healthy way of communicating. It's like, but we can't go there because race is sacred.
Well, and I would say, maybe this is a good transition, because I would say that the barrier there is that the discourse on race is split, and that there are these broad social cultural norms that discourse around identity issues, I think especially race, have to be split. So I'll just, for people who don't know what splitting is, it's a defense mechanism that was popularized by Melanie Klein in the 30s and 40s. It's basically all or nothing framing of individuals, groups, or ideas. And it's very common in mental illness, and it's used in a lot of different treatments. For people who know, it's in dialectical behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalytic treatments, motivational interviewing, transference-focused psychotherapy. There are lots. It's widely used in the field. And basically the idea is it's hard to tolerate a mix of positive and negative feelings towards the same thing at the same time. It's hard to acknowledge, I have strengths and weaknesses, you have strengths and weaknesses, there's pros and cons, risks and benefits. And so because that's emotionally difficult, it's conceptually difficult, people slide into this all or nothing framing where they look at one side, maybe the advantages, but not the disadvantages. They look at the positive, but not the negative. And in the short term, that reduces anxiety. It makes things feel more stable and coherent and easier. But it involves removing a lot of information. So one example would be with maybe depression. That somebody who's depressed sees everything about themselves as negative, everything about the world is negative, everything about the future is negative, and they can't tolerate acknowledging the emotions about hopefulness, about their strengths, about things that are going well. It says something about our psyche that for people who are depressed, in the short term, it's easier to be depressed than to tolerate that mix of there's things that aren't going well, but there are things that are going well. That the mix is harder to tolerate than the depression. It's pretty striking. But it happens in a lot of disorders. It's most linked to personality disorders like borderline personality disorder. There are lots of couples can split. They're thinking about moving across the country. One person one member of the couple really thinks the move is great. They think staying's bad. The other person thinks moving's bad, staying's great, and they can only hold half of it, and then they lock horns. So this happens over and over again. But I think it's really dominant in discourses around identity issues, especially race. And it's basically evidenced by only saying negative things about one group and only saying positive things about the others. So I could probably, in polite company, talk about white people being racist, ignorant, fragile, privileged, weak, even toxic or disgusting, needing to feel shame and pain, be discriminated against, being dismantled, on and on. There's lots of negative things I could say about white people publicly, and it would be okay. Could I say anything about white people that's unambiguously positive? I think not. I think that if you look at most media, you won't find a single wholehearted, unambiguous compliment or defense of white people as a group. And you'll find lots of negative. For Black people, and I think for other groups, it's the opposite. They're praised and celebrated, often in really grandiose, idealized language, strong, noble, beautiful, righteous, deserving to be proud and voiced and protected and, preserved, and their contributions need to be highlighted, and on. But can you talk wholeheartedly about negative dynamics in those groups? It's much harder. So you end up with a paradigm where you're only saying negative things about one category, only saying positive things about the other. Anything that deviates from that is rejected as racist. People can't tolerate it. They can't tolerate feeling it or thinking it, and so they reject it. And so you're left with what's in effect an all or nothing framing of these groups. The problem with the all or nothing framing of groups, I think there's basically three main problems. One is it's not true. The groups are not all good and all bad. Every group has positive, negative dynamics and trends. If you're talking about them in all or nothing terms, you're distorting, you're missing information. It's really not even plausible, in my view, that races are all or nothing. Second, it's really hurtful and really unhealthy. It makes people hate themselves, hate other people. It creates conflict and division, mental illness, and so forth. It's obviously linked to mental illness and other problems. And the third thing is, having a discourse where we only say bad things about one group and only good things about the other does not serve any positive function. It does not create justice, truth, love, peace, prosperity, fulfillment, happiness, well-being. There's nothing that's being served by this. And it really is hurtful, I think, to everyone in society. The problem is, if I say something that's positive about white people, large sections of the culture, maybe the large majority, are going to actually literally perceive that statement, no matter what it is, to be false, racist, and immoral. And they are literally going to experience any discussion of a problematic dynamic in another group as false, racist, and immoral. So people have really internalized splitting at a deep level. It shapes their reasoning, it shapes their morality, their identities, what they can feel and not feel, and everything about their worldview, how they perceive events. And I think you could go through and think about how this shapes what gets censored and what doesn't get censored, discourses on disparities. Often if a non-white group overperforms, let's say more Asians are doing better in STEM jobs. Why is that? Because they're smart and hardworking, they're smarter and more hardworking than white people. They're underrepresented in comedy maybe, or music or something. Why is that? Because of white racism. You look at Black people are overrepresented in comedy and music because they're smart and hardworking. They're underrepresented in STEM because white people's racism. So what has in effect happened here is when you're talking about disparities, this as just one example, it doesn't matter which group is higher or lower. The explanation is always the same. It's about the badness of white people and the goodness of the other group. And you can't suggest a causal factor that is not split. around disparity debates without being accused of racism. People have internalized this to such a deep level throughout society that it shapes reasoning on a wide range of issues, criminal justice, education, so on. So I think you could just look at issue after issue. I think there are entire academic fields where nothing non-split has been written in decades. and it's just such a, but it's in the media and it shapes literature and the arts and all kinds of things in less direct ways. But so you're talking about this couple where one of the partners, when things are stressed, insults the other one for their race. Well, if it's a black partner insulting a white, if it's somebody who's black insulting their partner who's white, the therapist is ambivalent and unsure how to address it. If it's a white partner insulting the black one, they're not going to be ambivalent. They're going to understand that that's totally unacceptable and not suitable for a sustainable relationship. So what part of our conflict is, how do you do therapy in a culture where broadly people of all races and all backgrounds have so fully internalized race-based splitting? If you suggested that, you know, as a couple, if you're going to be an interracial couple, you have to like something about European culture, European American culture, like something, you have to kind of value that, as it can't just be negative. But sometimes they internalize that view. So I think it's a pervasive problem that shapes issues not just in mental health but throughout culture.
There are so many places we could go next. I'm just going to pick one. I'd wanted to bring up histrionic personality disorder. So this is not an episode on personality disorders, but it is an episode where we talk about unhelpful mental habits and ways of seeing and relating with the world. And I've been expressing a lot lately that I'm concerned that things we used to consider unhealthy, that we used to want to help people heal from, are now being promoted as the right way to be, right? So when we talk about splitting, right, that is a component of borderline personality disorder. Not just just because a person splits doesn't mean they have BPD. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But that's part of the pathology, right? And we could go through, and we're not going to, but we could go through all the different traits of some of the most common personality disorders, and we could pick out ways that we see this in the culture at large, on social media, and ways that we see these types of behaviors being promoted as like the right way to be. So if our job as clinicians used to be that if we see a personality disorder, we diagnose this and we treat it, and we try to help the person find a more integrated, whole, functional way of being in the world and relating to other people and getting their needs met, that used to be our goal. But what do we do when the whole culture is working against us? Mm-hmm. So, people who are having these kinds of discussions that you and I are having, we talk about this with borderline and we talk about it with narcissistic traits. I think one thing I don't see very much discussion around is histrionic personality disorder. But if you look at the traits and behaviors of histrionic personality disorder, they are predictably expressed to a grand degree in places like TikTok. So, I posted something on Twitter about this recently, and one of my followers said, "Oh, that's a real thing. There's a name for it." So for those who haven't heard about this, could we talk a little bit about histrionics?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just say, aside from histrionic, I think probably all the personality disorder all the personality disorders are going to be escalated in a society where there's a lot of splitting, based on demographics or any other thing, that they're all going to go up. A narcissistic split is that somebody sees themselves as, always deserving praise, never shame, for example, or always superior, never inferior, or something like that. Those are type of narcissistic splits. Borderline people tend to flip more, where they see somebody else as perfect and then see them as evil, or they see themselves as having it all figured out, and then the next day they're a wreck. So they tend to have this kind of unstable splitting pattern. I think with histrionics, histrionic personality disorder, you're seeing more of somebody who um, is really attached to getting attention, and needing to be seen, whether it's in a good or bad light. Sometimes it doesn't matter, and can't tolerate not being seen. That it's this, but yeah. But you wanted to talk about something with histrionic personality disorder that was beyond just splitting, though. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I just think my audience is interested in psychological literacy. Some of them are therapists or therapists in training, but some of them are just, lay people who are curious. And so I just want to, provide a little bit of psychoeducation about this, not so that you can go around pointing your finger and labeling people histrionic the moment you don't like them.
Right.
That would be dramatic and dysfunctional. But I think we need to know that this exists, and that it has been conceptualized as a pathology, right? So the person with histrionic
Right.
personality disorder is someone who, as you said, needs to be the center of attention at all times. And part of how they go about doing this is through these really superficial displays of exaggerated emotion, as well as attention-seeking mannerisms, style of dress, and so on. And I think if we look at some of the most absurd and concerning things that we see on the internet, the highly influential people on TikTok, for instance, who are out there vying for the attention of a young and impressionable generation, we see these traits. We see that there's a lot of I'm forgetting the word that's commonly used to describe their language, but like language that's simultaneously grandiose and empty, right? Using a lot of
Right.
big words or these flourishes on everything, as if things are very significant and meaningful, but there's not a lot of substance behind them, right? And then you see the
Yeah.
dramatic
Yeah.
styles of dress and the hair and the makeup, and it's almost as if it's designed to be as eye-catching as possible. And I
Yeah.
am concerned that there are people who genuinely have histrionic personality disorder where, if they were to go to a competent therapist, that would be recognized, and who are highly influential, but that part of their influence is kind of making this an appealing behavior pattern for young people to emulate. Do you know what I'm saying? These superficial displays
Yes.
of
Yes.
emotion.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there's definitely, um, there seem to be large social cultural trends that are kind of like shaping personality dynamics in people. And um, we were talking before the recording a little bit about one of those maybe being, you know, a heightened focus on the external and a neglect of internality that might be cultivated by things like social media and TikTok, and that there's constant external stimulation, um, less time that people spend being with their inner worlds and feeling and daydreaming or fantasizing or free associating or playing. That you kind of get kids who, younger kids who have a hard time knowing how to play, have a hard time dreaming and fantasizing. And older, maybe younger adults, even older adults who are having a harder time knowing how to free associate, knowing how to talk about what they feel, in a deeper, reflective, connected way that the space where people are more comfortable is this very superficial, externally focused space that tends to be about your external experience in a very superficial way, external stimulation, not about internal states, your inner world, your depths of feeling, that people are kind of less connected to some parts of themselves.
Right. I
As
think
a
there's a
as a
connection there. I'm glad you tied it together because I had wanted to talk about the histrionic stuff, and you had mentioned the internality versus externality. And I appreciate how you just drew that connection. It makes me think of how, one of the reasons that histrionics are so good at getting our attention is because with this exaggerated emotion, um, they behave in ways that the rest of us would only behave if something were really significant. Like, hey, I'm trying to get your attention. There's something important going on over here. And,
Right.
because we have empathy and curiosity and people can spark feelings in us, we go, "Oh, really? This must be important. I better pay attention." But what histrionics do is they just do that all the time about everything. And often there's very little that they're actually going off of, right? And so there might be a little bit of feeling there somewhere or like something that happened in their day, but it only takes a little bit of something and maybe there's only so much that they're actually able to feel before what's the next thing we do with that feeling? Well, we exaggerate it and we externalize it and we make it very colorful and we try to get everyone's attention to the point where, I'm putting on a show here with my feeling. I'm like acting on a stage and do I actually like know how I feel and what this feeling means and what it's trying to tell me or am I just kind of habituated to this pattern? And so I think when we have these influencers behaving like that, then it sends a lot of false signals to the rest of us. A, that there's something actually important and significant happening here that's worthy of this level of emotion.
Mhm.
And therefore that there's a crisis or there's something to learn from and that this is how we express emotion. This is how you're supposed to do it. And
Yeah.
I think a lot gets lost. I mentioned the other day, like in this article I wrote, you probably didn't have a chance to see it yet, but I just published an article yesterday called Human Rights or Special Privileges. So the backstory behind this article is that I was suspended from Twitter for calling into question the slogan trans rights or human rights by unpacking what people mean when they say trans rights. What are the common demands of gender activists? And are those actually things that we consider basic human rights or are they special privileges? And at one point I kind of explained, how one thing that most of us don't consider a human right is the ability to threaten suicide in order to get what you want, and how we normally treat that in psychotherapy. And I talked about the differences between, let's say, the suicidal pattern you'll see with someone with persistent depressive disorder compared to the suicidal pattern you'll see with someone like borderline personality disorder. And how with borderlines, like if you have a patient with persistent depressive disorder, he might tell you his thoughts of suicide after 3 years of not telling anyone. And
Right.
in that moment, you're grateful that you've done a good enough job in therapy to make him feel safe to say that. And you really want to signal that it's okay. I welcome you for saying that. Thank you for letting me know. And you want to encourage and welcome that open expression of emotion. Um, Whereas, and that's just the classical persistent depressive. I mean, it can coexist with borderline, for instance. But, then if you look at the classic borderline case, though, it's I want to kill myself this, I want to kill myself that, I want to kill myself every day. It's like a greeting. It becomes just this
Mhm. Mhm.
broken record or this way of saying hello or this way of saying hello. I'd like your attention, please. Can we talk for a minute?
Mhm.
And in those cases, you don't want to always. It's not always the right approach to say, "Oh my goodness, thank you so much for telling me. That must have been so hard for you to say."
Mhm.
You don't always want to take it that seriously if that's become a maladaptive way of trying to get attention if you know the patient well enough to know that there's not actually an imminent threat.
Right.
So I feel like that connects somehow. People with histrionic personality disorder, if that coexists with things like borderline, they might use suicide that way, but they sure do use a lot of things that way. They lack that subtlety to be able to enjoy and engage in the kind of normal human interaction of hello, how are you? And just talking about normal things and enjoying the nuance in them. It's almost like the flavor palette of someone who lives on junk food, where the taste buds only respond to intensely sweet, salty, fatty foods. Um, so then what do we do about this young, vulnerable generation that's getting their influence from that, and they're not learning that emotional intelligence of how to feel their feelings or developing that internal taste for developing the preference to actually be able to manage their emotions. They're developing a preference for not being able to manage their emotions because they're getting rewarded for it.
Yeah. Well, right. It's like cultivated, and then the inner world becomes this dark, scary thing that they don't understand, and they can try to numb out and to it, or maybe it comes up. But you definitely see a lot more self-image related concerns and anxiety are definitely on trend in mental health. And it fits with this idea that the types of personalities that are rewarded on social media, I mean, it's at the same time, it's like, what's going to get you lots of clicks or lots of likes? It's like something that's dramatic and superficial and takes 20 seconds. And then what's the gratification of like a click and a like? Like the emotional satisfaction really isn't the same as having a friend that you spend an afternoon with or something like that. So things do seem out of balance, and I'm I'm concerned about how kids develop in this culture. Um, they can't really get off social media because all their friends are on it, and so if they just stop doing it, they're isolated. And if they do it, then they're pushed into these kind of social dynamics that really cultivate a lot of anxiety and aren't as nourishing as one would hope relationships to be. So it's very concerning. The 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 thing that's one thing I'll say, this is kind of a side point, but research takes so long. I once read it was a study of research about research, and it said the average amount of time from when a study's conceptualized to when it's published is 7 years. The average. So how long is it going to be until you have a robust literature about long-term effects of this stuff? 40 years. It'll be like, by then it's like, why even do it? It takes so long. It's like, so we kind of, I think it's worth listening to our intuitions a little bit about this stuff, because to have robust meta-analyses or longitudinal studies or a really rich debate on these questions, that is going to take a while.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. If you like what you're hearing, now's a great time to like, subscribe, follow, rate, review, or share. You can also support the podcast by visiting sometherapist.com/shop, where you will find goods and services I have personally curated to support your well-being and enrich your life. We're just building the shop, so check back periodically and feel free to suggest recommendations. All right, now back to the show. You had mentioned a couple of other topics we might explore. We'll see what we have time and interest for. You mentioned superego issues in wokeness, reaction formation in wokeness, and the potential risks of large-scale social contagion related to gender and sexuality issues. Is there any of those that you want to explore at this point?
I think reaction formation is really interesting in relation to what we were talking about earlier. Maybe not the most recent topic, but a couple steps back. Um, for people who don't know what reaction formation is, it's a defense mechanism. And it's basically to avoid feeling something, you feel the opposite. I think that's so. The example that I was given in my class on this when I was introduced to this is that your redheaded stepchild. Okay, that you're a step. Imagine you're a stepdad in a new
Hey, I have
relationship.
2 stepchildren who both have red hair.
Okay, okay. Well, you know the phrase redheaded stepchild,
Yes.
but yeah,
It's funny.
I love redheads, by the way, and I have a little red, by the way. But the but okay, so it's like your stepchild, and you can't stand this person, and so you hate them, but that's not tolerable. Okay, so you love them way too much. And again, this is unconscious. So you think you love them and you don't realize that your love is actually fueled by hatred, but it's going to come out weird. You're going to get them lots of gifts they don't want. You're going to hug them in ways that are uncomfortable for them. You're going to want to take them on trips that they don't want to go on. You're going to be kind of intrusive and at odds, and there's going to be, and you're going to push them away with all your love and things like that. So it's like a hate-fueled love would be an example of a reaction formation. And then you don't realize, that you think you love this person, but you actually hate them, and that's fueling it. So the most famous example of this had to do with gay rights, that there would be some preacher who was really anti-gay, and the features of this would be, it would be a man, he's preoccupied with homosexuality, he sometimes talks about it in a way that indicates like a desirous infatuation. There's a weirdness to it. Counterproductive arguments. I heard an argument against gay marriage that said, well, if we let men marry men, what's next? Men marrying chickens? It was like the argument's so bad it makes you support gay marriage more. And then they'd find out, down the road, you find out that they're seeing gay prostitutes or something like that. It came out, or, that's kind of the cliche. And so what's happening is actually it's not like a ploy. They really can't tolerate their homosexual desires. So they take the opposite view that they hate it, but their anti-gay behavior has this weird tone to it that's weird, and it's like driven by this infatuation and desire. So that's examples of reaction formation. But where I feel, I'm just hypothesizing this, I think that there's a lot of it around race. You see, and I think some around gender too. I mean, with race, I mean, there were riots in 2020, white college students in the black neighborhood burning down the library in the black neighborhood. They care so much about black lives, they're going to burn down the black neighborhood library. They care so much about black lives, they're going to make sure none of them have effective policing and that all the criminals are back on the streets. They talk to black people in a condescending way. They say things like math is racist because black people aren't good at it. It's like they sound like hate, and they feel like hate, and they're counterproductive. They push potential allies away. They hurt the people they express love for. And it just has all the markers of, if you really hated black people right now and you couldn't express that, you might become woke. And that would be a reaction formation. Yep.
I feel like I've seen a video of one of these activists, a white one, of course, like screaming at the top of their lungs, I love black people.
Right, right.
And, I look at this and I think, do you love them or do you fear them? Because I know what it's like to get those wires crossed. I wouldn't actually go to hatred. I'd go to fear, because I think we're living in a fear-based climate, and that our ways of talking about race only increase fear. Because if you're white, you can do no right. And you are
Right.
always at risk of getting your head chopped off, no matter how much you're trying to virtue signal. And I just see
Right.
people walking on eggshells more and more. It would make sense in that environment. Like, if you can't get comfortable enough to have a down-to-earth relationship with someone where you're both seen for the complexity of your humanity, you can enjoy a sense of humor together, you can poke fun at each other, you're not worried that anything you say is going to send them into a rage. If you can't have that with someone, how can you say that you love them? When I talk about getting your wires crossed, like I had Stockholm syndrome basically from being in an abusive relationship where I was put into a situation where I had to appease this person for months on end because of a certain power that they wielded over me, which is also another thing in that latest article that I wrote for anyone who wants to go and read that. And you do get to a point where you're genuinely confused. Do I love this person, hate them, fear them? I don't know, because I'm so busy doing that fawning behavior where my nervous system is actually in fight or flight mode. I feel unsafe here, but my way of dealing with that is to try to appease.
Right.
I think a lot of people are feeling fear and calling it love. And I wonder if it's maybe not even too different from like the classic Catholic fear of God.
Hmm.
Because there is this kind of absolute like authority figure. There's this idealized split.
Yeah,
The approval of blackness is like what you're cowering in fear begging for. Like,
right. And why is that? Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, the repressing fear in and making that love, or it's I would say, my advice from a therapist to therapist here is look at the body language, look at the nonverbals, look at the tone of voice. I saw an elected representative was speaking to a black uh, uh, member of the Trump administration, I think. I'm trying to think about the details. I don't remember, but it's like her voice went up an octave when she spoke to him, which to me signifies condescension in a way that's really not appropriate to that kind of a figure, compared to when the white officials are on and it's like, you listen to me. And there's something about that communicates respect in a way. But I think there's something about the way that the tension, the body language, the tone of voice, the word choice, it shifts. And a lot of times that's going to be a better indication of the affect than the content of what's being said. And that's but yeah, is it fear? Is it, I think that's, the good, not a bad hypothesis.
is now a good time to go over this email that I received from a listener?
Sure. Do I know what it is?
Nope.
Okay. All right.
No,
Sure.
but I wanted your thoughts on this.
Okay.
I actually have several like emails and messages and things people have sent me that I was hoping to get to in a Q&A. And when I did try recording a Q&A by myself, I just had such a hard time talking without there being someone on the other end of the screen. But this one really is something that I would like to explore with you. So this is an email I received from a listener named Josh. Hi, Josh. So he says, "Hi, Stephanie, great podcast, and congrats on speaking openly about important issues. I'm a clinical psychology doctoral candidate headed to internship, and I had a career question for you. What advice would you give a future mental health provider who still has to traverse licensure and a year of internship about speaking their mind on blogs/social media? I listened to the podcast where Helen Joyce interviewed you and heard how hard it was for you when you received that ridiculous complaint. For more context, my internship site is in a city that just passed a bill to outlaw conversion therapy, awesome, where they conflated sexual orientation and gender identity, problematic. How would you handle this specific situation given your experience? What advice more generally would you have for early career therapists? Anyway, hope you're doing well. Keep up the great work, Josh." So you can see why I wanted your input on this, because I think Josh would benefit from hearing multiple perspectives. And you're a supervisor, so you work with people just like him.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I know a lot of people who are supervisors who are in the closet, and the students are in the closet, and they see each other and don't know. It does happen. I uh, should I go first, or do you want to go first?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually really want to hear your thoughts on this.
Um, I think that this is a very personal type of decision. I told the story where I'm at the training site. They talk about hating a white male patient just because of his race and gender. I spoke up. The rest of my time on that site, pretty awful. But I thought it was worth it. Speaking from my heart, candidly and directly, and saying something that I still believe is true and was the right thing to say and do, felt good to me. And I think it was the right thing to do. I'm proud that I spoke up. It was very hard. It was a hard year after that happened, but I don't regret it at all. Um, I can't make that decision for Josh. You have to weigh the costs and benefits of, the risks and benefits of having this stuff out here and what might happen if it got found out. I knew, I think one of the things is if you're going to say something controversial, now you have to be perfect. It's like the types of graces that you would get to make mistakes as a trainee are taken away from you when you have a controversial opinion. I teach a class, I teach about splitting, I teach other things that are controversial. I've decided I get three things. I get three things that I get to do over an entire semester that are controversial. I can't do four. I start self-censoring after three. So I just kind of decided, I've got to pull my punches a little bit. I can't have every class be like this. That's just not going to work. But I can do a few, and I know that there's a chance that I get students who file a complaint, I get fired, and I'm willing to take that risk. I have other sources of income. I'm not as vulnerable as an internship candidate right now, but I think it's worth reflecting on what we all value and what's worth it to us and what isn't. There are definitely times that I self-censor and I think this isn't worth it. It's not going to be productive. The risks are too high. There are other times where I really think carefully if I want to speak up, exactly how do I want to do it that's going to leave me feeling good about it. And then there are other times where I'm, where I'll say something or not, but I just think you have to be thoughtful about it.
I'm really glad that the timing of this email coincided with the timing of my interview with you, because I really think you're the perfect person to go over this with. And I thank you for that nuanced answer. I agree that this is a personal decision and you have to weigh the costs and benefits in your own life and assess the landscape that you're in, assess the timing and who's around you. I would say, look for a good supervisor like Andrew, if you can. Look for one of us, at least a supervisor you can be open with. And, think about choosing your battles.
Let me jump in. I'm sorry. Sorry to jump in.
Mm-hmm.
Have a therapist who gets it. I mean, if you're a student, you're probably, most graduate students in the field are in therapy, as I think they should be, or in psychoanalysis or whatever it might be. Make sure that you have somebody who gets it, who's a mentor, a therapist, something. Sorry.
Yeah. And join a group like, Andrew and I met through Critical Therapy Antidote, Thoughtful Therapists, one of these groups. You can join my Discord server for therapists, which is just getting started. And think about choosing your battles and planning strategically for what's most important to you. For me, I decided that it was more important for me to live in integrity and, think about how do I want to look back on this time in my life when things have changed 10 years from now. I want to look back knowing that I was one of the people who was an early whistleblower, not who cowered in fear. I was part of that change, but I also did that from a place of strength where I was, already licensed and in private practice and had a certain degree of security and some backup options. Like I'm, writing, I'm podcasting. So there was this like, well, if I have to, plus I was in the process of, when I first started taking these risks, I knew I was going to be selling a house that I owned. And I've recently sold that house. So like if I lost my license right now, I'd have like a year's worth of money to live off of while I figured out my next move. And so for me, I was in a position to do that. And you have to assess what position you're in, and what's most important to you. I will make the point. I would also say, Josh, if you're not familiar with James Esses, to listen to him and chat with him. I'll be having him on the podcast. You know, he was somebody who was not so lucky, and he was in grad school and spoke out about gender and got kicked out of grad school. And so that would be a valuable perspective to get as well. And then I would say another way to think about it is, in terms of what populations you want to work with, and identifying some protections that you have in working with people with disabilities. So there's one of my Twitter followers, I can't remember the name of the account right now, but he's somebody who specializes in disability rights. I think I'm going to have him on the show. It's a little cloudy right now. Sorry. I have like a long list of people I'm going to have in the near future. But he has given me some information about how the law actually protects people who are in a position of advocating for people with disabilities. So, you know, it's one thing if you're pushing back on ideology in school and, you know, standing out like a sore thumb. And you are going to stand out no matter what if you say anything about this. But, you know, maybe you could think about it more from the approach of, instead of pushing back on what I see as being unhealthy or contradictory about this ideology with mental health, think about going into maybe specializing in working with detransitioners, if that's an interest of yours, because we're going to see a lot more detransitioners over the coming decades, and they're going to be traumatized and they're going to be afraid to trust us as therapists. So what do you anticipate it would look like in the landscape of your grad program and internship and the community that you live in if you were to start talking to people about, I'm really interested in working with detransitioners? And that's a clinical population who needs help, right? And so framing it in terms of who you're working with. Another thing that you could think about is, you know, today Andrew and I have talked about victims of racially motivated abuse who are white. I'm one of those people. And, you know, do you want to frame it as like working with abuse victims or victims of racially motivated abuse, and not necessarily even specifying upfront to everyone that you work with that includes white people who've been targeted, right? I think the main issue, though, is that when it comes to gender, it's very increasingly hard to not choose a side as a therapist, because gender is touching the lives of so many people. There's no way of setting up a practice where you avoid it, because you could have the most ordinary patient in the world and their kid could tell them they're trans tomorrow. And you're going to have some, you know, you're not going to want to feel like a deer in the headlights when one of your patients comes to you with something related to gender. And I think it's very hard to be neutral on this issue. And if you decide that you want to work with victims of gender medicine, which is something that I care about and speak about, then, you know, you can't simultaneously learn what I've learned about victims of gender medicine and be neutral or positive on the issue of affirmation. I think that, you know, talk about splitting, like our field is split, and a split has been forced where you kind of have to choose a side, in my opinion. I don't know what you think of that, about that, Andrew, but I just feel like you can't not pick a side, and that will be the issue you run into if you decide that you have a clinical interest in supporting detransitioners, is that if you have a clinical interest in supporting detransitioners and your classmate has a clinical interest in supporting trans people, and they're all in favor of the affirmation model, and you're saying, I've heard horror stories from people who deeply regret that they were treated with the affirmation model, well, then there's there's going to be a conflict, and hopefully your teachers and supervisors are adequately prepared to handle that conflict appropriately.
Yeah, it's not I don't have the specialty in this area that you do. So but I mean, I think one thing I can say for certain, this is extremely risky. I, uh, I will say this. This is not quite related just to Josh, but what I will share with you, which I'm sure you've heard things like this before. Um, when I started my PhD program, I um, I couldn't find a supervisor who had knowledge about trans issues in Brooklyn, in Manhattan. I It was hard, and when I took psychopathology, my DSM class, basically, there was not a unit on it that I recall. Very little, if anything. I think it wasn't there at all. And then within about a year, you couldn't ask questions. It was so stunning to see in 1 year, no questions. And I thought, this is so fishy that all of a sudden we have a consensus on everything and there was no discussion. Something I've never seen in the field of psychology, where we fight about everything. Nature versus nurture, social versus personality, CBT versus psychodynamic. You think about all of these vicious, decades long research driven debates, and to see in less than a year, um, it's considered a sign that you're a bad person if you ask questions. Um, uh, but I think what that privately, when I raise things with people who I feel safe with, not necessarily people who are in critical therapy, antidote, or heterodox academy, even just regular people, they have concerns. A lot of people have concerns who aren't speaking out. But that doesn't mean that they're involved or necessarily. But anyway, but yeah, I think that's probably right now. That's probably one of the most radioactive things you can go after. I think the race stuff is pretty. I think talking about anti-white hate is pretty radioactive too. But yeah, you can't be a radical on every issue in your program as a graduate student. I think you could do. Yeah, I don't think that's gonna work.
Well, Josh, I think maybe that was a confusing answer, because reality is confusing,
Sorry.
and this is no, I mean, it's like we said all the right things. I think both of us, like, we acknowledge the reality of the situation, right? We didn't split it. We didn't oversimplify it. We shared
Yeah.
our ambivalence about the situation, the predicament that Josh is in. And I do hear from a lot of people like you, Josh, a lot of grad students and interns who are trying to figure this stuff out.
In every field, it's in medicine, it's in education, it's really across the board, and we're in a unique place as mental health practitioners to really be able to provide counseling and support to people in our field, but in every field around this issue. There are a lot of people going through this.
Yeah. If anyone listening is a multimillionaire and you're looking for some good works to fund, feel free to suggest that people like Andrew and myself and all of these, wonderful, frightened young therapists could, we could start our own programs. I had a little fantasy this morning as I was going for a walk. Uh, and I say fantasy for a reason, because it's very unrealistic, but it was like of forming our own body that's not exactly a regulatory board or anything like that, but like a body where people who've been mistreated by therapists who came down on them for their white privilege or anything like that, where they could submit a complaint to us and we could send a letter to the therapist like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
our group of professionals, with this 100 signatures on it, like, has been notified that a patient feels that you have been harmful to them by enforcing their ideology, and consider this a warning, and here are some resources to educate yourself about evaluating your bias. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
fantasy,
You know,
but
that's not unrealistic that there are places where we could get grants for it. It is it we are in a we're in a really exciting but very difficult place of like going from 0 to 1, where there aren't organizations that fund grants in this area yet, yet, but there can be. And I think so. It's like we don't have like a you know institute where we can go to get funding. But when I was in graduate school, Heterodox Academy didn't exist. It developed after I was in for a couple of years. And at first, graduate students couldn't join, and now there's that. And graduate students are in it. They can get mentors and things like that now, and so we can build things, and it's a very exciting time.
by the way, how do I join Heterodox Academy? I'd love to be a part of that.
I think you just go to the website, and I think it's free, and you just enter your email, and they have grants. They're only higher education. So I have pitched mental health related projects to them, and they say only if it's higher, it has to be higher education for them
What
to fund anything.
what do you mean
So it
higher
could be,
education? Isn't that what we do? Like grad
well,
school?
it could be they want to fund research in particular. Um, you should look at what their grants are, but they wouldn't like fund a clinic or psychotherapy services or anything like that. Um, it has to be,
I
yeah,
have
within
ideas
the
for
university
research
system.
projects. I mean, I have ideas for
Yeah,
research projects a lot. I wouldn't want to actually be the one to carry them out because I don't think I have the patience for that. But I mean, things along
yeah,
the lines of like Lisa Littman's field of research, and she's done that all herself, right? But like, I think we need a lot more studies on the mental health needs of victims of gender medicine. Um,
yes. Oh, no doubt. And they do. Heterodox Academy really values. This is my personal opinion. I think they really value being nonpartisan, and they do not want to be seen as partisan. And they work very hard to maintain that image. And I think it's true. There are a lot of liberals in Heterodox Academy. They're all concerned around free speech issues and open inquiry issues, but um, they're not. So that sometimes determines what's going to get grant money or not. There are so many institutions we need to build to develop best practices and mental health services and research and expert witness testimony, and to have the data to back it up, and to have professional support networks, and to be appealing to licensure boards or whatever, and address improving standards. I mean, you can just think of dozens and dozens of things that we need to do. And um, yeah, hopefully it's starting now. I mean, just even the podcast, Critical Therapy Antidote, Heterodox Academy, things are starting. More is going to come. We're just keep working at it.
I haven't mentioned this on the podcast yet, I don't think, but are you familiar with the group Partners for Ethical Care?
No,
Okay,
no, no.
so Jennifer from episode 3 of my podcast shared the story of how she helped her daughter desist. Her daughter started identifying as trans at the age of 10.
Uh-huh.
So Jennifer shared that story. And I mean, I think, every day I think about it because I have stepkids who are 8 and 10. And I think about what people are doing to 10-year-olds. I'm just like, I have a 10-year-old in my life and I can't picture it. Anyway, what's my point? Jennifer from Partners for Ethical Care, great person, great organization, and they are embarking on a campaign of putting gender resources on postcards that they're mailing to therapists around the country. So they're actually like going through Psychology Today, looking for therapist mailing addresses, and sending
Hmm.
out this postcard that says something like, "What's happening in the world of gender? Don't you wonder? Here's some podcasts," and they list this podcast as well as their podcast, The Witness, Gender: A Wider Lens, and Benjamin Boyce's YouTube channel. So I'm excited because this podcast, the timing of the release of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist was originally scheduled for mid-May, in part because that's when they were going to do the postcard launch, but that's kind of gotten delayed. So they're kind of slowly in the process of sending those out. So I've gotten a lot of listenership, and those postcards haven't even gone out yet. So I'm really excited because I actually have
Great.
no idea what portion of my listeners are therapists. But there's about to be a whole new wave of word of this podcast getting out specifically to therapists. And I'm hoping that we'll reach all of those moderate people who are somewhere in the middle of trying to figure out how to think about all this as clinicians. They've seen the rise of gender-related situations. They're looking for resources. And this is going to point them in the direction of my podcast. So for
Great.
anyone who's listening that is a therapist, especially if you're one of the people who actually found out about it through the postcard, please let me know. I'd be so delighted to know that. Now that we are talking, people like Andrew and I and other listeners in the therapy world, there are a lot of ideas, as you were just saying, Andrew, to be explored about what kind of institutions we can set up, what needs funding, what needs attention, and this, whole new generation of victims of gender medicine, which, that's my common refrain, but as well as, white racism survivors and other groups. So on that note, Andrew, tell us what you're up to and where people can find you.
I have a website. It's hartzpsychology.com. There's mostly information about my private practice there. Some of my articles, I'm not good at keeping my publications up to date on that website, unfortunately. But I am hoping to start. I'm pursuing funding resources to start a clinic that focuses on people who need support around these issues that we've been discussing today. So I'm hoping to start to maybe create a separate website that has more resources and to focus on those services soon. So keep an eye out for that. Right now, it's just the website with my lists, with my articles. Yeah.
And there's some great articles. I recommend people check those out. Are you on any social media where people can follow you?
No.
Unlike most of my guests, we're all so busy on Twitter. You're over there just living your life without Twitter.
It is what it is. Maybe soon. We'll see.
Okay. Well, Andrew Hartz, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast with Stephanie Wynn, LMFT. This podcast is produced by Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix. Special thanks to the talented musician Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. At sometherapist.com, you can find more information on any topic, guest, resource, product, or service you've heard of here today. You can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you would like to ask a question, suggest a topic, be a guest, or invite me to speak, you can email us at hello@sometherapist.com. You can also send us a voice memo with your question, and we just might play it. Of course, just because I'm some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.